Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and build a great team. Today, we're going to talk about a difficult topic. And our topic today is grief and recovering from grief. Grief is a very individual experience as well as a universal reality. At some point in our lives, we will all lose something or someone that we hold dear to us. And it will make a significant impact on who we are, how we understand the world, and how we do our work. But the thing to know about grief is that while it's painful, it can ultimately lead us to a deeper appreciation for life and living. In the end, this can only strengthen our resolve to lead meaningful, full lives and do work that has a positive impact on the world. Today on our episode, we're going to talk to a trained grief recovery specialist and longtime HR professional who will give us some excellent advice on how to help people, our most precious resource, work through these tough times. And as a Mission First People Always leader, it's just one of our responsibilities. We take care of our people. So sit back, grab a notebook, grab a pen, take some notes, because this is an important conversation that's coming up next.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
My guest today is Kim Kerr. Presently, Kim works at Meta as the program manager for people experience, and she leads the jobs and career expectations program. She's a longtime HR professional, and she has a lot of expertise working in a lot of different corporate environments. She has a number of passions, all fueled by her heart to serve others, including her desire to help people process and recover from grief more productively. And that's really the essence of our conversation today. Kim is a grief recovery specialist, and she's going to share some of these insights that she's developed over extensive training and work in this area. Kim holds a master's degree in organizational communication from the School of Communication at Northwestern University in Chicago, where she focused her research on teams and relationships and organizational effectiveness. She's completed doctoral studies at Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Education and Psychology, and that's where I met Kim. Kim was one of my outstanding students there, one of those special, unforgettable students because she embraced learning. She embraces the practice of leadership, and we've maintained a really positive relationship since she was in my class several years ago. So we're colleagues at this time. We're friends at this time. So there's no doubt in my mind that Kim has wisdom to share with us on this topic. And Kim, I'm excited to have you on the Mission First People Always podcast today.
Thank you so very much for the invitation and certainly that introduction. I was wondering who you were talking about.
No, that's you, Kim. You are a special friend. And what I've always appreciated about you is your huge heart to help people. And I see it in every aspect of your life. And now in your role at Meta, you have the opportunity to impact people very broadly in a very important, large organization. So let's dive into this conversation about grief. I mean, sometimes in my intro to our podcast conversations, I'm really revved up and excited. And today it doesn't feel right to be excited about grief, but I think what's important about our conversation is understanding the impact that grief has on people, the impact that grief has on performance in the workplace. And so let's unpack this for our audience. And give them some resources and some insight that they can use to help their colleagues and themselves work through these issues and areas as they arise. So let's begin with just what are some of the common causes of grief that affect our coworkers in the workplace?
Sure. For the last 20 years, I've been experiencing as a leader in the HR space and certainly a leader in community outreach spaces, just watching people deal with grief, loss, and transitions. The truth is that most of us don't really understand that grief is normal and it's natural and it is relative to the experiences that we're having with any kind of loss. And we shouldn't compare those losses. But it's typical things, Dr. Mike. It's death. It's divorce. It could be retirement. It could be moving. You could lose a pet. You could have some sort of financial turn, stock market crashes. It could be health issues for yourself or a family member. Even marriage, as joyful as marriage can be, losing your freedom, of being kind of single could be. One experience I had was graduation. I was going to have to leave a cohort that I was so, deeply connected to and knitted in more ways than just our studies after having spent 2 years with them. And then certainly the research that we were able to do. We've seen people having endings to addictions. They've been so accustomed to doing life a certain way. The end of that addiction takes away the one crutch that they may have had. But ultimately, it's any place where you have unmet hopes, unmet dreams, and unmet expectations.
That's interesting, Kim. And so what you've done is just broaden the conversation beyond the loss we experience when we lose a loved one or we go through divorce. It's a much broader perspective on grief than I've considered before. Have you? The last 2-3 years have been really tough on people with the pandemic and changes in the workplace. Have you seen a rise or an elevation of the issues associated with grief increase greatly over the last 2 or 3 years?
Absolutely. I happened just before the shutdown that the world has experienced to take a group with me to really kind of examine that to the Grief Recovery Center of Chattanooga. It's the place that I was trained. That's where my mentor founded her work and has passed it on to a successor. And I noticed that the group of ladies that I took on that retreat, were having an experience personally, professionally, that would just guide me to lead them down this path. Well, that was, let's say level one. Literally at the moment that we all got news of the pandemic and the stressors that it brought to our homes, having to be at home with little ones around our ankles and trying to work while doing so, being sandwiched in between, taking care of our elders, keeping them safe, as well as babies and ourselves, being caregivers in the middle and sometimes being sick. And certainly the numbers of women that were deeply impacted and not able to work in the ways that they had worked before. Maybe some of them being so impacted as caregiver that they are not going to be returning to the workplace. Those impacts are definitely heightened. And certainly there isn't a gender specific to being caregiver. We just saw, a greater number of impacts to women, and of course that affects the trajectory of their careers. Suddenly you have husbands and wives that are at home all day together, and maybe they were coexisting as roommates, for instance, but now they are, dealing with themselves, having to be in the house and deal with each other. And, if they have unmet hopes, unmet dreams, unmet expectations, and sometimes assumptions that maybe they shouldn't have made, and you're in a 24-hour nonstop, no outlet, no one can leave home kind of circumstances, this is why we saw a rise in domestic violence cases with both adults and children. And again, why we've seen, more people turning to drugs, alcohol, and other short-term energy releasing behaviors. That's the grief recovery concept I'd like to unpack. But we've definitely seen far more of that with, the pressure that the pandemic brings.
The Mission First People Always podcast has a broad audience, but my sense is many of our listeners today are frontline leaders in organizations, maybe middle managers. They lead leaders and some executive leaders as well. Why should leaders in the workplace be familiar with, be aware of grief in the workplace. So what are the costs and consequences for us in business, for us in organizations that we should acknowledge and maybe allow to prompt us to respond more effectively to grief in the workplace?
Sure. Great question. And I actually did pull out a resource that the Grief Recovery Institute was able to provide. They have an excellent book that's a manual, but they also provide their certified specialists with this, additional research. I'm just going to do it by the numbers for a moment, right? So the hidden costs of grief, according to America's Workplace in 2003, that the death of a loved one was $37.6 billion as a cost of business.
So you're saying if for those who lose loved ones, that carries an enormous cost to the workplace. How does that manifest? How does that play out? Is it absenteeism? Is it distraction and we're less productive? Where does that number come from?
So it's certainly absenteeism. I mean, a little bit more than just the bereavement time. The experience that, individuals are having, it causes them to have, not as much clarity, confusion. It affects their performance. Sometimes, 60% say that some of their decisions were directly impacted, by the weeks that they were dealing with a grief incident for several months following that incident. So long-term standing impacts. 85% of management level decision makers indicated that their decision making ranked from very poor to fair in the weeks or months following a particular incident. We see people making poor financial decisions. Again, if you make business decisions relative to the finances of a company, it all could have a direct negative impact on those decisions, and certainly to the employees that are working there.
What my assumption that you've addressed already coming into the conversation is that grief is largely a result of losing a loved one. But more broadly in the workplace, what should we be on the lookout? Because oftentimes we know when someone loses a parent or someone close to them, heaven forbid, a spouse, but sometimes things that we grieve aren't things we talk about. We don't talk about it in the workplace. We hold them close. So if I'm a manager, what are some of the telltale signs that people may be grieving and need help?
Sure. So oftentimes, these things manifest as areas of opportunity for employees to take advantage of employee assistance programs. So as an HR manager, you would take on any kind of employee relations kind of intervention to ask, is there a need for employee assistance programs to support you with, whatever's happening in your home or in your personal life? That's a confidential way to get your needs met. But some of those indicators, and again, most HR professionals are keenly aware of these, but when we try to train managers in the same, has there been a shift in communication, a shift in the levels of engagement that maybe the person has in some work that they're experiencing? Because if the grief incident is relative to work, just consider that they could be in conflict and therefore are shutting down in their normal work because they can't seem to get over whatever it is they've lost. So change is constant. Maybe they've lost decision-making authority, or, they don't feel their place on the team. These are all, matters that impact engagement. Those that deal with domestic violence at home, you'll see them to be, lots of, times they're a little bit more reserved, a little bit more quiet. Maybe they're hiding, maybe absent, maybe late, maybe not focused. Again, very foggy to make decisions or be engaged in the ways that you normally are at 100% when you're carrying such a heavy emotional burden, and particularly at work, and not able to talk about that emotional burden. I mean, who's going to raise their hand for shame that I'm at home having a domestic violence circumstance? I can tell you in my case, the disconnect for me when I was dealing with my parents, dealing with medical conditions that required much more of my focused attention, it took me away from some of the ways that I was able to just naturally work on academics as well as work. And so then I found myself in a conflict between how do I take care of my parents and not focus on my academic studies? And how can I focus on my academic studies and not focus at the primary income that allows me to take care of one of my greatest values, which is to support my family? So when you see your employees, essentially grappling with conflict, a manager's gift is to give that feedback. I've noticed something is happening with you lately. Is everything okay? And how are you doing in this area of family or whatever else that the manager already has in terms of knowledge of that employee? That's the experience I've had, is being able to see the signs. They look just like everything else: domestic violence, divorce, graduation, retirement. Essentially, loss is the same. And how we deal with that is 100%.
So, Kim, you gave us a pretty simple way to step into that conversation with folks. What if someone shares something with you that's really heavy? You mentioned domestic violence. You mentioned caring for elderly parents. That's heavy duty stuff. One response might be to refer them to an employee assistance program, and in a large organization like yours, I'm sure that's a very rich and abundant resource. But if I have a smaller business, I don't have access to those resources. What's a manager to do? What's a human being who cares about their coworkers to do? And what if I'm not a manager? I'm just noticing this in my colleague who seems to be kind of a half step behind and responding differently to workplace scenarios than maybe she did or he did 6 months ago. How do I deal with my peers?
So I'll tell you how I've responded for years. I mean, I'm going to go back a little dated here. For 2001, September 11th was one of those big catastrophic events that would lead to, again, the world sort of being a pause, at least here in the US. And, I found myself in huddle groups just being supportive and listening and sharing some of the more recent events, like, the circumstances surrounding George Floyd. We would find ourselves again in listening tours as managers to give space for conversation that is not just natural to talk about and to bring up. And some, advanced training, is available. There are lots of resources to help you. And the Grief Recovery Institute does offer training. They offer training for you to develop what I call grief recovery specialist level listening, which is at the heart level. They have programs and resources available. And for anyone interested, you certainly can check out the grief recovery method. And the website is rich with resources and opportunities. They have a reference tool that basically tells you about 61 ways to deal with grief. So that's a free resource. You can go out there right now and get that ebook and download that tool on how to experience grief and how to help people through it. There's also the Grief Recovery Handbook. It really is sort of my Bible of this work. Their 20th anniversary edition is available, over 1 million copies sold, translated in many languages. So John W. James and Russell Freeman, founders of the Grief Recovery Institute and authors of the book When Children Grieve. So that's like the main book. They also have When Children Grieve for those that are adults supporting children that are grieving as a resource. And again, there's so many. There's the Grief Recovery Handbook for Pet Loss. There's a book called Real Answers and Real Questions from Real People on Moving Beyond Loss. And one of my favorite out there for those dealing with relationships, there's a book simply titled Moving On, Dumping Your Relationship Baggage and Making Room for the Love of Your Life. There's also going to be a grief recovery method for that specific discipline. So more to come from the Institute, but those are the resources I would suggest from the Institute. More broadly, certainly in your local community, there are mental health resources that are made available, usually local hospitals, some community centers. And if I were as a manager and I knew we had benefits that covered psych, I would certainly refer counseling as a resource to anyone that was on my team. You can also reach out to a grief recovery specialist and search for them again. Griefrecoverymethod.com is the website. You can look for a specialist that's in your local area, and they could certainly help you work through this evidence-based program that is researched by Kent State University to show that, dealing with the pain of emotional loss and using this program, is very effective to helping you become emotionally complete.
And we'll certainly have all those resources in the show notes. And I appreciate your point about listening. Sometimes it's about what we say to someone, and we don't need exactly, the right, clever words to say. It's our presence, it's our heart, it's our openness to hearing them out that makes all the difference. Is there anything, and you're an HR professional in a very large organization, and you've been in very large organizations that are very conscious of these things. What are there any boundaries we need to be aware of that we shouldn't cross? How do we support someone without being intrusive? How do we maintain our professionalism? We want to be a good listener, a good friend, a resource, but we don't want to push someone in an area where they're not comfortable going. What advice would you have for us on that front?
Sure. Even as an HR professional, I always go to the experts. And so folks that are sitting on our employee relations teams, and again, also those employee assistance program counselors and advisors, those intake folks have the skill and specialized training so that they can help people process this. So the first resource I would say is if you notice something with one of your colleagues that just leaves you a little concerned, I'll just put it out there. If you notice that they have a bruise, and they're coming up with strange things that look like there's a domestic violence, you don't do them a service by being quiet and pushing that under the rug. You do them a service, as well as your team, frankly, so that person gets back to wellness sooner by alerting someone on your team and alerting them, whether that's a hotline or calling your employee relations leader or an HR person, just to say, I'm not sure what's happening here, but I think it's worth investigating. That provides a space for them, the HR leadership team that you would share that with to take some steps. If it's someone on your team and you're a manager, again, that gentle nudge to say, how might I support you? Is everything okay? How are you doing? Not just talking about the work, but talking about the person. Again, people first, mission always, right? It's to keep the focus on them. And I would say, again, last but not least, if all else fails, again, making a report to, a local resource that's available. If there's a suicide threat, there's a suicide hotline numbers. We can certainly look up those online. Any other type of free resources available in your neighborhood, your community, your city, your region. I would say identify those. And again, just gently say, I notice something is happening. I don't, want to invade on your space, but I just want you to know that I have some resources and I'm available to support you as a heart with ears. That's the best gift I got out of grief recovery training. I can be a heart with ears and just listen, no judgment.
That's excellent. A heart with ears. What if, I've been in the workplace a very long time at this point, and I've encountered a couple of situations where colleagues have passed away. In some cases, very suddenly. They're at work one day and they're not there the next day. It leaves a big hole in the team, a hole in the hearts of many of their coworkers. Any advice for that horrible situation that if we're around long enough in the workplace, we may experience it?
Sure. Again, anticipated. We don't think about our colleague not making it to work the next day. So you typically, you have it where HR needs to know something has happened, right? But then also the persons on the team do need support. And so I've seen it again, where we have brought in grief counselors into the workplace, lots of times in schools. Again, my mentor was often called upon to go to serve, in academic settings, particularly where there were children involved. Some actions could be bereavement leave. Maybe some need to grieve. And if you're close enough to a colleague, I mean, we spend more time with our colleagues sometimes than we do with our family, just really being considerate that people experience grief at 100%. So whether I lost my dog or my best friend, I experienced that at 100%. And my need to be able to take care of myself emotionally is real. So bereavement leave, sick leave, vacation time, maybe a redistribution of the workload to allow people who have reduced concentration some time away. But honestly, Dr. Mike, one thing I would say that's probably the best is some AAAs that I use. It's acknowledging because you are aware and associating. So I have seen something, I have an awareness of it. I want to acknowledge that I've seen it. And then I also want to associate. That's where the heart with ears comes into play. I actually get to be something for someone else that's dealing with that. Now, if it's the entire team that's going through the loss, then maybe you need senior leadership to be aware, to acknowledge the impact that has emotionally, right? How devastating it might be. And then as well, how might we support you? They associate with you in the ways that are most beneficial to you. And that is different for every person and frankly, every team.
Kim, we always like to conclude our conversations with guests with an invitation for them to offer some very practical advice, something that each of our listeners could begin doing right away. In your case, what can our listeners do immediately right away to be that heart with ears with folks, to connect with people who may be hurting, who maybe need to simply be more aware and observant of how life is impacting colleagues? Give us a piece of advice that folks could begin doing tomorrow.
Sure. The Grief Recovery Handbook is an excellent resource to help people understand this process that's neglected and often misunderstood. So I would say first thing is get a Grief Recovery Handbook and learn quite a bit. Again, you could download the free 61 Myths and certainly have that available. But the one thing that I would like to leave with our listeners today is understanding that an incomplete past may doom the future. And the reason why you want to pay attention to that doom is because you could be a person that's adding to it. And I say that because we're often well-intended, but sometimes we don't say the right things to grievers, like, don't feel bad. Go and replace the loss. Go have ice cream when you've lost something is, typically what we've done, growing up as children. Or grieve alone. People tell you just get by yourself sometimes, or time heals all wounds, or just keep busy, or be strong for others. The Institute really covers these topics, again, very well in the Grief Recovery Handbook, but all of them are myths. So really what there is to allow people the opportunity to become emotionally complete. And that requires a set of correct actions. It's an action program for moving beyond. And if you can take hold of those concepts, again, I've had over 20 years of experience with it, and I've seen lots of people become whole by just having this resource on their shelf.
Kim, how can people get in touch with you to either follow you or your work, or perhaps even invite your assistance on something that they're dealing with? How can people get in touch with you?
Thank you for that invitation. So they can find me on my website, kimmkerr.com and /connect. And myself or someone on the team will get in touch with you. I do have a team of other specialists that I partner with. You can find me on LinkedIn at Kim M. Kerr, Kerr, so KIMMKERR, and also on Twitter at KIMMKERR1.
Thanks for being a great guest on today's episode, Kim. Today's topic was a tough one. No one likes to focus on the tough times that we all experience when we lose something. And grief is very real, and the impact of grief is very real. As long as we live in this broken world we live in, we will experience grief and loss and pain, and that grief, loss, and pain affects us in the workplace. We learned on today's episode that impact could be manifest through absenteeism, poor decision making, people just being disengaged and disconnected from their work until they're able to work through this. Normal office communication patterns may fail and people just may not be as responsive. So what's the call on us as leaders? It's to be alert. It's to be aware. It's to stay connected with our people and offer them our assistance. And maybe our assistance is just listening to them, hearing them out. Maybe it's a referral to a professional, someone in your HR group, or maybe the employee assistance resource that your company provides. If you're in a smaller organization and those resources aren't available to you, maybe it's connecting someone with a community-based organization, a mental health professional, a grief recovery specialist, as Kim mentioned today. We as leaders are obliged to help our people, to serve them, to make sure that they are well cared for. And sometimes we're the bridge to that care that maybe we can't provide ourselves, but we're aware that it's available. We're aware that we know folks need that help, and we can be that bridge. So thank you, loyal listeners. I'm so glad you're here. I hope this conversation is helpful to you in some way today. I hope you don't need it in the near future, but I'm afraid that we all will at some point, at least. So access some of these resources we learned about today. Take good care of your people. And until next time.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.